Okay, so we welcome Stef, the well-known colleague of us, who is applying for the position of coordinator of the Andean Agri-Food Systems Initiative. So today he will be having the seminar and then several interviews. As we know, Stef is specialized in agrobiodiversity from Andean University. He got his PhD in that university and has been working in the Andean region, of course, in topics and in Asia, in topics of food security, food systems, value chains, for CIP in the past, but also CIP. And he will be sharing with us his ideas about how these initiatives can be actually made a reality. So, Stef, welcome.
Thank you, Louis. Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be here with so many friends and colleagues. And thank you for the opportunity to give a presentation about my vision of what I think could be the new Andean Agri-Food System Initiative that CIP could start. So let's get into the presentation because there's quite a bit of ground to cover. Basically, I will divide this presentation into three main blocks. First, I want to outline what the issues are and where the demand is. Then I want to outline kind of what could be the main building blocks of a new Andean initiative. And last, but certainly not least, kind of like a strategy about how we could initiate and kind of resource this initiative. So first, let's take a food system lens. Food systems is a topic that is becoming increasingly dominant in food and agricultural development area. FAO, but also the CIR are adopting more and more a food system lens. So this is one of the frameworks of food systems. It's from the high-level panel of experts from FAO. And it includes, of course, the food supply chain, the food environment, consumer behavior, which are kind of the personal lenses to which people take decisions about food acquisition, diets, which results in different outcomes, nutrition outcomes, environmental outcomes, based on socioeconomic outcomes. All of these are driven by food system transformation, by big global drivers, including climate change, technology innovation, policy. The food system is becoming increasingly globalized, and this is also affecting the Andes. So a lot of the CG and a lot of the centers, including FAO, also the office in Latin America, are moving more from production and quantity to having a look at quality. How can food systems provide quality diets that provide opportunities for inclusiveness and at the same time are sustainable? So this publication from Jessica Fanzo from the high-level panel of experts in 2017 was very influential. David Navarro, who was the food prize winner last year, also is working on this report with the Eats Lancet Commission on Food for the Planet and Health, which is about to come out and will really give a lot of guidelines about how we can innovate food systems. And also the Stockholm Resilience Center has outlined that there's kind of 9 elements of planetary boundaries that define our food system. And of course, genetic diversity, biodiversity, which is part of biosphere integrity, is one of them which is already in the red, and in others there is still time to act. So why is this global issue important? Well, basically because the current systems are outstripping the planet's resources, and we are not feeding ourselves in a healthy way. No? And that's the reality of the current global food system. Some people say the food system is broken or the food system is failing us. Especially the last one, the food system is failing us, is not completely correct because we as humans define the food system. So we have the possibility to correct the food system. But overweight and obesity, greenhouse gas emissions, micronutrient deficiency, land degradation, biodiversity loss, dependence on a few crops for our food, food waste, hunger, are some of the elements that define this challenge. So inevitably, we have to move to a sustainable food system. And a sustainable food system is one that enables people to access food, nutritious, safe, and affordable food, to restore and conserve key elements of ecosystems, to limit release of greenhouse gases, and to contribute to prosperity of people everywhere. And this is from the Milano Pact, from the Milano Group statement from 2018. Of course, when we zoom in on the Andes is quite different from the global reality. Still, a lot of these elements of scales impact the Andean food systems. So what are the issues in the Andean food systems? First has to do with diet transitions and health. So while there has been a huge progress in combating stunting and undernutrition, and these rates are going down, Latin America is at the same time confronted by increasing obesity rates. And this is often called the double burden of malnutrition. And this is seriously affecting most of the Andean countries, including at the extent that in Chile it's above 30%. And Chile has actually been one of the countries where front label packaging and food policy has really been kind of revolutionary to kind of tax and punish unhealthy ultra-processed food and all the marketing behind it. But if we also look at the Andean diets over the last 50 years, these have really changed. So if we look, for example, in the case of Peru, in terms of calories, the calorie intake has gone up. If we look, you can clearly see the crisis here in Peru and how it has gone up again, like the amount of food, like portion sizes have gone up and are continuing to increase. There is a big issue with the protein transition, animal protein being less environmentally sustainable than the plant protein. If you look at Ecuador, actually this trend is very clear because pulses are decreasing in the diet while meat is increasing in the diet, and fat consumption has gone up twice in the last 50 years. The third issue is that we are depleting our planet and impacting our natural resources negatively with our food system. So even though the Andes is very minuscule, also the Andes is globally connected to global food systems. So not as much maybe as Southeast Asia, but a lot of the food flows and interdependencies of food also affect the Andes. And these global food flows result in carbon footprints. Of course, another element of the Andes is building on some of the research, of course, done at CIP, is the huge carbon stocks that we find at higher altitudes, and that just as foreign carbon sequestration have a huge potential for carbon insetting and carbon offsetting. And of course, Andean agrobiodiversity of all the 8 Vavilov centers, the Andes is probably the most diverse center, and especially the eastern flanks of the Andes are world renowned for still delivering many new species and many new discoveries. At the same time, they're highly under threat. So even while there is very little evidence of genetic erosion, there is a process of a gradual displacement of this diversity. Then another element is food and inclusiveness. Who governs the food system and who participates in the food system? And here, if we take an example from my own native country, from Holland, you can see this is the supermarket chain in Holland. And all the decisions from the food purchasing companies for all the major supermarkets are just taken by 5 companies. So the question is, how many companies are involved in the Peruvian supermarkets in this food system? So food system governments and who participates and how consumers can participate, and their influence is a relevant topic. And of course, if you look at retail diversity in the Andes, there is a huge diversity with different levels of formality and with different levels of inclusiveness, all the way from supermarkets, small convenience outlets, family stores, permanent markets, organic markets, street markets, small eateries, all the way to fast food and their marketing. So there is definitely a whole set of trends and issues that we can address in the Andean region. Shifting markets, more energy-dense diets, climate change, shocks and trends, greater urbanization and migration, aging and a feminization of rural population, income and knowledge, especially among youth, shifting aspirations. People don't want to eat tuna anymore, people want to eat steaks. Supermarketization and retail formalization, rising obesity and persistent undernutrition, transparency and sustainability in the food systems, and research and development as drivers of food production and developments. So how can we take these elements and kind of make it into the building blocks of what could become an exciting and relevant new Andean food system program? For that, I've taken the high-level panel framework and kind of modified the framework. And I think we could adapt this framework, which includes food supply chains, food environment, personal filters, and consumer behavior, and would look at 3 different outcomes of the food system: environmental outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes, and nutrition outcomes, and especially the trade-offs between these 3, and how this impacts health, social inclusion, economy, the environment. To do this at the food system level, we could do it at 3 different levels. First, we need to do food system characterization. We need to understand what is actually happening in the food system and how the food system is transitioning. So diets and nutrition state, food flows, food environment, resource efficacy, life cycle analysis. There are different types and ways we could characterize the food system. And this is important to really take the pulse of the food system and to understand what is actually happening, what are the transitions, and how is this different in a city, for example, from the countryside, or in Bolivia from Ecuador. Then there is a whole series of possible things we can do to innovate in the food system. We could think about market upgrades in traditional markets, food labeling and front packaging, information provisioning, food literacy and education, curriculum development, because especially working with young people who change their taste buds is one of the main pathways probably, because with older people it's very difficult to change their diets. School meals, dietary guidelines are some of the elements. And then for scaling, of course, private sector engagement and policy engagement will be key. So depending on whether we intervene in the food supply chain, in the food environment, or in consumer behavior, we have different options to innovate in the food system. The way from labeling, taxing, information, but in the end, it is the consumers who make the final decision. So really, if we want to reshape the food system, we have to start from the demand. We have to work with consumers. And that's a big paradigm shift also in the CG. We've typically worked with producers, rural producers. We have not often paid so much attention to consumers, and especially to urban spaces, with the Andes also becoming more urban. So when we look at Andean cities, can we include these Andean cities? This is probably a necessity to also include cities. And we know that the Andean population is becoming increasingly mobile. Many people are part-time farmers, spend part of the year in the city. And so these are big food sheds. So can we make those food sheds more healthy? And how can we work in cities to provide healthier food? And this is a photo of Juliaca. So many of you will know, but many of these people are actually one generation back, 2 generations back. They were living on the countryside. Then how, in terms of value chains, how can we innovate the value chain and the market system work? CIP, of course, has a huge legacy working on this type of approaches, and it could be seen as kind of Andina plus. We could take novelty and high-value Andean products, go beyond potato. If you look at mountain regions in other parts of the world, the Pyrenees, the Alps, the Himalayas, where do they get their most sustainable income? Mostly it's from niche products, unique products that are of high quality. They cannot compete in terms of volume. So, and there the Andes has a huge potential. It could be business-led cases based on market demand and novelty products. We could, for national supply, or cities, but also how can we bring value back to the land. So tourism and food also holds a huge potential for the Andes. Then, of course, the digital economy and online shopping also holds a huge potential for provisioning restaurants, for direct marketing with consumers in Lima. Adapted market systems that have traceability, certification, guarantee systems are something where there's a lot of scope for innovation. And of course, we can take stock of Peru's reputation as a culinary and food destination. Some of these people can be the champions of these new type of initiatives. And we already know, for example, the work of Gaston Acurio has had quite a big impact on the beta, the pescado, so when people and restaurants can provide certain types of fish during which type of the year. So we would move to market systems and multifunctional multi-actor systems, and not only look at the value chain per se, but also at the supporting functions, including finance, infrastructure, regulations, traceability, informal mechanisms, and with different actors. And in the nutrition-sensitive value chain, we could take a focus like all the way from using CIP's biofortified varieties or even native varieties with high nutrition contents as an input, all the way from working with schools and school feeding programs to influence decision making or consumer behavior and consumer education. So finally, what we need to do is to maximize the entry points and minimize the exit points for nutrition. Now, in the Andes, based on Papa Andina and other experiences, there have been so many examples. And many of you probably know Adalberto Soto. I'm a big fan of his work, but I think he's kind of an example of what you could do. He has taken the example of potato and applied it to Oca, Oyuco, and Mashua, which he is currently exporting to the Dutch Antilles, but also to Europe. He's not working anymore with pure varieties. He's also working with mixtures, and also he's bringing people back to the origin and working with agroecotourism. Of course, climate change is a big topic, which we would include in the Andean initiative. Especially the whole areas in red are most vulnerable, and the Andean systems are most vulnerable. And I see two basic components of an Andean climate-smart agricultural focus. First, we would work on Andean climate-smart agricultural innovation platforms, where we work with adaptation options, could include resistant varieties, early varieties, but also water harvesting, irrigation, information provision, digital advisory, mitigation options, carbon insetting, carbon offsetting, nutrition security is of course part of climate smart agriculture, and also work on an Andean climate action knowledge hub. The main challenge I see in the past work of CIP on climate change that it was often very high level and often focused on modeling. But how can you make it actionable? How can you make it actionable for people? And it's not that there is one formula for the Quechua, Suni, Una, Yunga. So every zone, whether you're on the east or on the western slope or in the north, it depends. Like these adaptation options have to be tailored. So you can see this kind of information and action hub kind of as a Pulgar Vidal dictionary of different options that people have to cope with climate change. And I see it as something that would have a big digital component, working with companies like BTEL, for example, to provide digital advisory options to smallholder farmers around climate change. So in terms of the CSA innovations, there are many options. Of course, in adaptation, it goes all the way from water management, diversification, resistant varieties, early varieties, seed system work and seed security, climate insurance, forecasting, climate services are among the options. In terms of mitigation, there is huge potential that has been applied mostly in the Amazon, but very rarely in the Andean region. So coffee and cacao are kind of taking the lead, but there is many options with agro-pastoral systems at high altitude to also work on this carbon offsetting and insetting options. And nutrition security, if there's no income and nutrition security from these options, of course, they will never be adopted. Biodiversity, as you know, this is the one closest to my heart, so I kept it last. But yeah, you see in this map from Conservation International that actually the natural capital in the Andes in terms of biodiversity is huge. And I think we can expand way beyond potato and way beyond crop wild relatives. We could include essential oils, for example, from muña or aromatic herbs. We could look at orchids, one of the main diversity of orchids, huge business in orchids. We could include animal genetic resources. So focus on crop diversity, neglected and underutilized species, crop wild relative diversity, so genetic resources, medicinal plants, ingenious and key systems, for example, Watawasi, Yauyos, these key systems that are landscape value but also have agrobiodiversity value and associated knowledge. So I see kind of 5 pillars for this in the Andean initiative. In situ conservation and diversity monitoring, CIP has a huge reputation in this area, and it's still a vital area that should be continued. Bioeconomy in high-value markets, can we go to new types of bioprospecting and really take advantage of the potential? The classical saying like Peru es un bendito sentado en un banco de oro is still very applicable. Agrobiodiversity and ecosystem services, both for nutrition and for resilience, innovating benefit sharing and ingenious key systems for agrotourism. So one of the ways to do this, for example, is to initiate an agrobiodiversity champions initiative in which we would link the private sector, the maize sector, the bean sector, but also potato companies to adopt key sites, to commit to these sites for long term. They get a unique sites to support those sites. We involve local actors, universities in the management and the definition of the hotspots, and CIP and others providing the science input to do this work. So if we would do that, we can make a much better connection between the ex situ conservation and the in situ conservation, between the gap analysis and understanding the ongoing evolution of crop genetic resources. Last, kind of the building blocks, I see 4 cross-cutting elements. One, gender, youth, big data, and indigenous people. I think these are cross-cutting, independent of climate change, food systems, or biodiversity. Food systems without women is unimaginable. They are the cornerstone of food systems, but also thinking about transitions that are really lasting without involving youth is also unimaginable. So in a nutshell, for the building blocks, I see big data, climate smart innovation, novelty high value markets, climate action knowledge hub, nutrition sensitive value chains, city food shed, agrobiodiversity champions initiative, youth, gender and indigenous people, in situ conservation, and food system characterization, innovation and scaling. Now, how would we go about building such an initiative? Of course, this cannot be done from one day to the next, and we need a vision of how to build it. And of course, when we talk about building it, financial resourcing will be the first priority. And here I look at 10 different options that I identify for financially resourcing the initiative, taking advantage of climate finance, the Green Climate Fund, ICI type of funding. The Dutch government just announced a new type of ICI, but also private sector carbon insetting, offsetting. Philanthropy, there are a high number of organizations that are interested in food systems and also biodiversity. MacArthur Foundation, Betty Moore Foundation, Carasso Foundation, all of these could be involved. Food system finance, there is a lot of new initiatives around food systems. For example, the Alliance for the Future of Foods, which is a group of donors that have come together really to think about and to finance food system innovations. Bilaterals, of course, even though these are becoming scarcer and scarcer and more competitive, we should still include them, as some of them are specifically targeted to the Andes. Private sector, working with food companies, potato companies, corporate social responsibility, but also company foundations is an option. For example, Mitsubishi invests quite a bit in biodiversity, and I know that the Dutch potato sector has the interest to do benefit sharing in the Andes and also investment in key sentinel sites. Banks, IFAD just adopted a new structure that includes nutrition sensitive value chains. IDB, Rabobank Foundation is already active, for example, in Peru with Yanesha communities. Also national resources, Impuestos a la Renta, Canon Minero, in direct investment from some of these national opportunities that are available. If you look at Cerro de Pasco, for example, in the case of Peru, they have a huge Canon Minero, including for science, but it's very difficult to access, and mostly it's returned. But can we access some of these funds? Internet campaigns and donations for highly technical projects, CJR programs, they will probably all involve food systems in the future. Big data, H4N8, it was involved a lot with H4N8. Flagship 1 is on food systems, can we also become part of that? And then there is also other investors, for example, RDA from Korea, they are still very interested in quinoa, already a key partner of CIP. Bitel, a Vietnamese company working in Vietnam, interested in data and digital advisory. Chinese, CATAS, Chinese Academy for Tropical Agricultural Sciences, already has an experimental station in Ecuador. Can we work with the Chinese to work on investment in the Andes? We have to source the program as well with young scientists. I think often young people make the place dynamic, come with a lot of new ideas. So how can we trigger to get young people to the program? Of course, first thing is to have lead scientists for the finance sub-programs. So each of those 4 pillars that I presented, ideally as soon as they are financed, we get a lead scientist to take the lead on those areas and make those areas grow. Then we can think about PhD and postdoc programs to attract lots of young talent. Visiting researcher programs to have students, but also sabbaticals. Seconded postings. Tirat has a lot of nutrition capacity, GPOs, but also having people from the FAO, for example, work with a lot of food systems seconded at CIP, exchange programs, the public health program at Cornell, the Sandwich PhD program at Wageningen, and also the programs in Michigan. They have exchange programs for students. So students working, for example, with Tom Reardon on supermarketization, can we bring them here? Students working with Andy Jones on Andean nutrition, can we bring them here? And providing incentives to the young people, sponsorships, shows and tells to share experiences, and of course mentoring to make them grow. And then another element will be the partnerships, of course. We have to think about solid partnerships, and to start such an initiative, we probably have to work with quite kind of new partners, not necessarily the classical partners that we have worked with, and think very carefully about who would be our core partners in this food system initiatives. We can think about national partners, universities, or specialized centers. We have centers like Grade in Peru, or we have nutrition institutes, both private and public nutrition institutes, thinking about food systems. Can we engage with those? International universities with renowned Andean food system scholars. There are several that have interest, certainly to work in the Andes. Civil society organizations, both international and national. Organizations like Ricolto, for example, already work on food systems in Quito. And of course, there's international platforms like the Global Mountain Initiative, the RUA Foundation, which works on urban farming. And I think Gordon Prain, when he was leading Cosecha Urbana, also worked with them. They still have a food systems program in Ecuador. Private sector, we have to include them not only as funders or investors, but also they need to be on board if we want to change the food system. And a lot of the Nestlé's, Alicorp, they all have possibilities to work on food systems. They also have a vested interest to make them more sustainable. Otherwise, they will end up as the tobacco industry and have a bad reputation, which is already occurring. So work with sister CG centers, biodiversity, CIAT, for example, in climate change, CCAFs, and also think strategically about the governance of the Andean initiative. If we can have a good governance structure and bring on board people who are highly influential, but also critical thinkers, this could include chefs or politicians, scientists with a clear vision who can contribute also to fundraising and to conceptualizing the initiative. It might be a good option to think about a governance structure. So almost there. I think this is a 6-step plan to build the program. First, we have to make sure that we have the directions and priorities right. We need consultation for this. These are just mine ideas, but we need to consult these with stakeholders and partners. Make sure we work with the right allies. So who are the core partners that would be involved? Make sure we position the Andean initiatives, and communication will be key to really communicate this in a very attractive and relevant way. Have multi-pronged funding and investment, so we don't put all our eggs in one basket, but we put them in several baskets, and we have several strategies. Just based on my own experience with fundraising, and at CIAT, we get about 2/3 of our funds come from direct visits and direct engagement, and only 1/3 comes from calls from projects. So that active engagement is really important. People will want quick results, so we also have to be able to start, but not spend too many years just characterizing the food system without showing any results. We have to show quick results and to attract a positive spiral, and to build critical mass through capacity within the initiative. This is the last slide, and I'm not generally a fan of selling myself, but I think if you decide to hire me, these are some of the elements that I could bring to the Andean Food System initiative, and I think I can add a lot of value to building this initiative. So with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, colleagues online, I would like to give you the chance to ask any question at this moment, please. Is there any colleague online who would like to ask a question? Let us know. Otherwise, we will open the floor here in Lima. Maria?
Very inspiring. My question is, focus on potatoes and sweet potatoes to more Andean biodiversity?
Yes, I think that's a necessity. I think not only for an Andean program, but in general, for probably for CIP, it would make sense to think about its mandate and which elements of that mandate can be expanded. But working on food systems only with roots and tubers is kind of really limiting. It would be driving a car with only tires. No, you cannot work on a food system only with roots and tubers. Of course, they are part of the food system, but a component of it. So I think also in the Andes, if you look at the history of CIP, those elements were there in the past. CIP had a quinoa program. CIP with Miguel Holle, Mario Tapia looked at a lot of the diversity. Gordon Prain with Urban Harvest already took on urban issues way before the CG had a food system program in AIDS for an AIDS. So somebody already had that vision in the past. And I think it's still a very relevant vision. Also to grow a program, it's a bit like an Andean farmer's own project. You know? If you only manage one crop or one field, you simply are more exposed than when you have many different tools and many different technologies in your program. So it makes sense in terms of attending opportunities. It also makes sense in terms of making a solid program that is fertile ground like for making it grow.
Willie?
Thank you, Stef, for the presentation. I have two questions. One is related to rural agriculture. Yes. You talked several times on funding, and you have foundation that work. What is your view? Because, well, CIP do not work on urban agriculture for quite a long time. So you think on building up the urban agriculture capacities? And my second question is about getting funding from mining companies. And what is your view and your experience on that?
Oh, thanks. Those are two great questions. I think urban agriculture is just one component and one element of how to take cities into account. In reality, of course, the amount of food that people have in cities or growing cities is not that fast, but often in the peri-urban spaces is where people grow a lot of food, and a lot of the value addition to food happens. So I would not only focus on the city per se, but also the peri-urban space, and not only on the production, but specifically focus on the retail and the consumption. As soon as people move to cities, their diets change. Eating out, food away from home, becomes much more dominant when people move to cities, the convenience food. So their consumption habits change. Still, they maintain roots from their Andean or from their rural counterparts. No? So instead of working only on the production, I think within the Andean initiative, there should be work on Andean retail, the food environment. So what aspirations do people have, and what information do they have? So even though it can have a production component, particularly in peri-urban spaces, but I would particularly focus on the consumer side, because that's where you can have a lot of impact. And then in terms of mining companies, of course, this is a double-edged sword. No? And there is huge possibilities, and there is certainly, from the retorno a la renta, canon minero, a lot of opportunity for investment. If you look, for example, at Las Bambas in Cotabambas, and since they were taken over by the Chinese, and previously they were Canadian, it's become declared a conflict zone. No? The brother of my wife works there as a police. There's military in that zone. They have no clue how to interact with the population. No? So of course we can engage with them, but we should be very careful also with their reputation. So under what conditions, what autonomy, what they can communicate, how the investment is used, under what conditions, that needs to be negotiated very carefully. But I would certainly not close any options. I think it's a real option. I know in Cerro de Pasco, for example, having worked the last several years with Daniel Calcides Carrion University, that they have problems to access the funds that are specifically earmarked for science and innovation. And it's millions of soles, and it's returned every year. They simply don't have the capacity to write a good project. So there's a transaction cost, but I think it can be done.
Good. I don't know whether Hugo, Guy, Claudio, or any other colleague online would like to ask a question at this point. No? Okay.
Hey, Oscar.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
Michael.
Who is that?
Michael.
Mike. Oh, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm just doing it from my office. Thanks, Steph. It was a good presentation. My one question is, a lot of what you presented was, a lot of it was stuff that you were interested in, you were working on when the last time you were at CIP. Some of the vision for this new program is how do we utilize what's going on in the Andes for the rest of the world, and saying, what's happening with climate change is happening in the Andes before anywhere else. I just wonder if you could talk about how you would see work that is actually relevant in the Andes being able to be kind of put out for the rest of the world, or put out and utilized, either in other mountain regions or other, just highland regions that are going to be facing some of the same challenges. I didn't see anything in your presentation kind of addressing that, which is something that I think that we're looking for.
Thank you for that question. I hope my thinking has moved on since I left CIP. I think certainly the whole food systems thinking and the way I conceptualize it has evolved a lot. But your question, to get to your specific points about how to link Andean development to the rest of the world, that's a very challenging question, because the Andes are so different. So if you look at mountain environments, they certainly have some things in common, but that kind of programs were trialed in the past as well. I remember there was a program with ICIMOD that was called Himalandes, and they tried exchange of buckwheat, quinoa. And if you ask nowadays, how's the quinoa doing in the Himalayas and how's the buckwheat doing in the Andes, it has completely disappeared. So it's not very simple to make those exchanges between mountain regions, especially when we talk about food, because it's so embedded in people's preferences. But maybe we can learn kind of mechanisms about, like high-level mechanisms about scaling. How do you use digital advisory and advisory in mountain regions where there is much less access to information and infrastructure is more challenging? How can we use the Andean genetic resources and get out of the kind of lock-in that we are in using genetic resources? I know firsthand from Dutch potato companies that they would certainly like to explore in much more BIOS prospecting in Andean gene pools, especially in the diploid potatoes. They are very interested in the diploid land races, but there is a lot of fear about how they can do it within the current legal framework. But I still think that those investment opportunities are there. So making use of resistance traits, quality traits based on Andean biodiversity for global employment is certainly not another option. And then, of course, a third element could be global markets. No? To give you an example of that, before I joined CIP, I worked with Alfredo Menacho, who's the owner of Wawasana. Many of you will know Wawasana teas. No? That's when we promoted herbs, and that project has actually become quite successful. And I'm still involved through friendships with a few companies that work on essential oils. One of them is called Dr. Bronner, and another one is called Earth Oil. They are very interested in Munya and some of the Andean essential oils. So tapping into those new global markets, working with native diversity, I see as an option. But the mountain to mountain is quite quite challenging beyond the maybe kind of like the big scale lessons. Even within the Andes, it's challenging. Maybe it's not a satisfying answer, but that's all I could come up with. Thanks.
Just I will follow up quickly on Michael's question on the whole concept of international public goods that can be generated in the Andean region for the use in other parts of the world. How is your thinking? What type of international public goods from a research organization like it could be developed in an initiative like this for the benefit of the Andes, of course, but beyond that? So it is, what's your thinking of that?
I think the public goods come in the shape of tools and methods, and I think a lot of the work around how to use, for example, public data, how to integrate complex data from nutrition markets for food systems, and kind of the data analytics on that could be a public good. Another element could be food system characterization elements. Most of it is being done as we speak, but there are still certain elements like food environment and methodologies around food environment, shaping food environment at home, workspace, and at schools. That's still an area where there's a huge demand for method development. That could be kind of spearheaded in the Andes and could be replicated in other areas. And then, of course, I think we also have to go beyond public goods. So I think there's nothing wrong with getting a return on investment. And to work with private sector, I think we have to think about those conditions. What are those conditions that can? So of course, some things can be pure public domain, and some things can be ring-fenced for exclusive uses. And I think if we go, for example, with Andean agrobiodiversity, to assure private sector investment, that there has to be, not everything can be made public probably and immediately. It depends on what kind of scheme it is, whether it's social corporate responsibility or it's a value proposition. But those are some of the thoughts.
Okay, good. Now, Graham is next.
Yeah, thanks, Stef. Very good presentation. I like the way you bring in this food system framework to organize. So that's good. Then big data. So big data came up as one of your cross-cutting themes. You mentioned under climate smart agriculture the need for this whole advisory service, and a little bit at the end there we have this question from Oscar about you're going to have a huge amount of complex data. Now, this is a program that's going to operate across extremely diverse agroecologies, markets, so it's going to generate to work very large amounts of data. So what's your vision for how you would organize? How would GIS play in, and how might novel ways of getting that data used by all these people living across this broad geography?
So getting access to the data is step one. Step two is having the analytical capacity, and you need to bring in new talent for that. I don't think currently a lot of the CG centers don't have that capacity, and if we're lucky, we can prevent some of the Indians, instead of going to Google, to join the CG. But that skill we need to bring on board. And then there is the second element of infographics and making complex data digestible. That's the third step, kind of in the data value proposition. Now, what can you do with big data in food systems? The universe is really huge. We just won a project on using crowdsourcing in traditional markets. So providing routers in traditional markets, providing free internet, consumers and vendors log on. They have to answer 3 questions before they get onto the internet. The system is provided for a whole year, and we get a lot of information about what's happening at those markets. Who are the consumers? Who are the sellers? That's one element to actually do crowdsourcing. But another element is integrating just public data. That's another project that I've been working on for the last 2 years with Michigan University. We call it the EATS project. And that can be kind of replicated in the Andes, I guess, because there's between the regular household surveys that are collected, between the climate information from tsunami, between the censo agropecuario, between all those data sets, if you want, you can make them communicate. You can look how purchasing behavior affects diets and how supermarket growth affects people purchasing behavior. Those relations can be made. It's about getting the right agreements with the owners of those public data. So we can go to the institutions that have public data with a value proposition, and often they lack the analytical capacity, or they lack the ability to communicate across ministries. And that's where kind of a brokerage role is for the big data. Then another area in the big data is making it useful and actionable. So if you look at the climate smart agricultural profiles from CICAFs, they have been very successful, and they are often based on big data, but then they are presented in a very 5-pager, very clear form. We can make also food system country profiles or food system city profiles based on big data and identify investment opportunities. So that could be another type of use. And I think also to keep youth interested, we have to give it a digital touch. No? So youth and farming and youth and biodiversity will be a big issue. So can we do shape recognition with digital photographs to identify agrobiodiversity? Can we do, like they do for birds, for example, the Global Big Day, in which, by the way, Ecuador and Peru have a huge community of volunteers every year counting birds. It's only one day a year. Can we do the Global Big Day for agrobiodiversity? No, maybe we can do it if we work with rural schools. So there's many ways we could innovate, but I'm just thinking out loud. Yeah.
Very good, Stef. We're almost getting there to the end of the presentation and seminar. There is a question from Guy who is having problems to ask through the mic. So he's saying, hi, Stef. As you mentioned, cities in LAC are growing fast, and some rural sectors have difficulties in taking advantage of opportunities there. How do we bridge the urban-rural divide in the Andean food system? The question.
He is on holiday. Come up with a very creative question. That's
Thinking why from Uruguay,
yes.
that's why he's bridging the rural-urban setting.
Yeah, the first, it's not an easy question, because how much is there a rural-urban divide when the rural is becoming more urban? So is it still a divide? I think it's a question of mobility. I think people have double lives, especially Andean population. They spend part of the time in the city. As soon as they need to plant, they go back to the countryside, they plant. So that divide is becoming less clear. It's not the rural population, the urban population anymore. It's part-time farming, part-time urban, and that is the new reality. I think the divide in Peru and in the Andean countries still is the huge inequality. So huge inequality in the opportunities that people get whether you're coming from the countryside and have a Quechua background, or you're born in Lima and you have other opportunities. That divide is still huge, and it creates a lot of inequality. And that is, for me, a bigger divide than the rural urban. The only way to tackle that divide is to really invest in the next generation. So really investing in youth, education, fair opportunities for people to make a living, and a recognition of the value of what they produce, even though that may be small scale, but high value, and making the rural exciting again. That will be a huge challenge. If we don't make the rural exciting, then it's very likely that a lot of the traditional Andean elements will be lost. So we are lucky as we speak because it's still there, but it can go very quick.
Very good, Stef. I think we have a couple of more minutes, so basically we will just give you a big clap, please. During the process of interview.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Stef.
Yes, second panel.
Yes, second panel.